I'm here today with Lynn Beauregard. And Lynn, I always ask people how to say their names. And I know when you're speaking to Anglophones, you say Beauregard, and as opposed to the Francophones. So we'll go with either version depending on who's listening from the audience today. But
Sounds good.
excited to have you on the show, and thank you for joining me.
I'm so delighted and I'm flattered. Thank you for inviting me. This is great. And you can say Beauregard, you can say Beauregard, you can say any way you want.
And Lynn, part of what we start with every time we do the podcast is a little bit about your story. So tell us a bit about Lynn, sort of where you grew up, sort of the upbringing. I know you have an interesting story about where you've been and throughout your childhood, and how that sort of became a part of a formative, especially through the formative years, and how that affected who you are today. So I'd love to hear that part of the story, and then I have lots of questions for you today.
Okay, well, sure. So I was born in Montreal, a 100% French Canadian family. My father was a civil engineer and had the opportunity to work for the UN late 50s, early 60s, and worked for them in Cameroon and then Lebanon. And then I was actually almost born in Lebanon, but my parents decided to go back to Montreal. And then a little later, my dad was basically charged to essentially take a local Montreal engineering firm international and moved us to West Africa when I was about 2 or 3. So I grew up in Senegal, in the capital, Dakar, and so spent the larger part of my childhood there until the age of 13. And then at the age of 13, he went back to the UN. And so we moved to New York City, which was a bit of a challenge at the time because, of course, from one jungle to another, very different environments, as you can imagine. And at the age of 13, and I didn't speak English, that was probably the biggest challenge. And so we went to French school. We went to the French Lycée in New York. I was actually one of the things that I don't really talk about a lot is I spent the entire time in Africa taking ballet classes, and I had so basically 10 years of ballet. And when we moved to New York, I was accepted into the Juilliard School, and I went for my kind of sort of meeting with the headmaster or whatever it was, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough because again I just was so uncomfortable and just I guess insecure about the fact that I couldn't really speak the language very well. And it was kind of out of a movie, all the girls sort of stretching in the hallways and looking down at me. I'm like, ah. So I ended up going to the French school and learned English over, obviously, being in New York. Even if in a French school, you're just, learning it by osmosis, breathing in the air. So that happened pretty quickly. And then my parents decided to move just outside of New York City in Rye, New York. And so, but what was funny actually is my mom had no idea we actually spoke English. A year and a half into our stay in New York, she thought, okay, well, we only speak French at home and they only speak French at school. Therefore, they don't speak English. And then she was desperate to get out of the city. She really didn't like it and wanted to go back to more of a, suburban environment, pool and whatnot. And so we went for an interview with, again, the school headmaster. And I'll always remember her saying, well, my jaw was on the floor when I heard them speak fluently with the, at that age, it's easy and it comes naturally. So anyway, so that's sort of the background. And I came back to Canada to do my university studies. I went to Bishop's University. I took a major in psychology and a minor in business. And then from there, moved to Toronto and was offered a job at Maclean's magazine. And that was the sort of start of my career, I guess, in a
And
nutshell.
and Lynn, we chatted about this, and I had found this particularly interesting, which is why I asked you. And and it's interesting because sometimes we have very diverse starts to our careers, and in many ways we come at them differently, and we end up in some very interesting places. And how we grew up is such a big factor in it.
Yeah, it really is. And it formed me in so many ways. I did the math once it was about a total of 12 schools that I had gone to, including, primary, secondary, and then just moving back and forth. We did actually go back to Montreal for about a year and a half in between and I went back to Africa. So that was also, we went to two different schools there. It was what was, I think, the most formative thing for me was not just the language barrier when we got to New York, but way before that, having to constantly change and adapt and re, you know, basically understand the environment that you were in. And so I learned very early on to be kind of hidden a little bit so that I didn't stand out, and to listen as much as I could so that I could assimilate the language, the environment, the culture, the manner of speaking, the kind of the MO. And that really helped me understand that. I think in any environment, in any situation, that's really, really, really served me well, because I can come into just about any situation. You could probably drop me in the middle of Timbuktu and I would probably adapt pretty quickly because I have the ability to listen and engage, but I'm very curious at the same time. I think that really has served me well over the years and in everything in my career, in my personal life. Yeah.
And I think the that's it's interesting when you look in retrospect and think through some of those moments and how that's sort of made you who you are today. Lynn, I'll pivot a little bit, and I wanted to ask how you ended up in governance. I mean, you went to Maclean's, and
Yes.
yes, yet it's very different from ending up in governance, and probably at a time where you didn't have too many women sort of being active in the governance space altogether.
Well, it sort of happened through the route of event management. So 5 years at Maclean's Magazine, I was in charge of special projects. So I did organize events, and there was a lot of coordination, project management. And then I got to a point where I felt that I really wanted to pursue that. So I moved to another organization where um, essentially they were focused on researching key trends and then producing related events and programming around these themes. So, which it was really, I loved it because, research, wrapping my head around concepts and ideas that I had not really necessarily encountered. It was a little bit of an intimidating start, but then you have to produce a whole event around something. This is back in the early 90s when, you didn't have cell phones, everything was done kind of by fax and by phone. So the research really involved talking to a lot of people, listening to them, understanding their challenges, finding out more about what made them tick, and then really understanding now how can we transfer the information and who best to bring in to kind of sort of carry the expertise over. And so I got involved in that. And one of the events that I was in charge of was the annual Corporate Secretaries Congress. And so I took that over and I started working on that. And I got very, very familiar very quickly with the corporate secretaries, their world, the regulators, the issues around them. So I kind of even compared to being a journalist, where instead of writing an article after you've done the research and the download, you're putting on an event and then all of the issues and all of the conference topics, basically address what you've heard is top of mind, are the key trends and the top experts, and bringing those in to sort of impart the information. So that's what sort of kicked it off. And then during the time that I was managing that event, I partnered with the two ladies that had started this firm and were working, had TO Corporate Services, had started TO Corporate Services. TO is actually not for Toronto, it's for Tilford and Oler, the two partners that created it. And they had created the Canadian Society of Corporate Secretaries back in 1994 when the Day report came out, the TSX report. And that really kicked off everything in terms of what was happening in governance, and really focused on the issues around the corporate secretaries, because it was really a report that affected the public issuer community.
Hmm.
So I was kind of there while all of this was happening and producing these events and understanding that these governance issues had all of a sudden come front and center and were basically in the limelight and had to be addressed and had to be discussed, because corporate secretaries needed a forum to not only meet and kind of interact, but also network, but look for resources that they could bring back to their organizations, to their boards, and kick off, the whole process, and really find ways to be compliant. And so I was kind of in the middle of all that. And over a few years, I was approached by the partners of the organization and was asked if I wanted to take over the managing of the business and the managing of the Canadian Society of Corporate Secretaries, which is GPC today. We changed the name back in 2016.
Okay, and so to some people, it may still they may still remember it as more related to corporate secretaries, but obviously it has evolved, and certainly governance is
Yeah.
beyond even some certain immediate roles like corporate secretaries. And Lynn, a couple of things now. These are a bit more general, but how have you seen sort of the governance practices change over the years? Like, and I mean, you've had now exposure over some time. What have you seen that journey look like, especially in the last decade?
So much has changed. It's for me. So this takeover that I did of the basically the managing and the ownership of the business that ran the Canadian Society of Corporate Secretaries, that was in 2002, and it had a little bit of a membership, it had a little bit of events, and it was just a small kind of entity. I would call it was like a bit of a toddler. And so that was 22 years ago. And folks ask me, like, do you not get bored? And I'm like, no, I don't have time, because governance has evolved constantly over these years. And so the first thing, obviously, that I saw change was the role of the governance professional, the role of the corporate secretary. And we call it governance professional. Maybe I'll go into that. But what really struck me was that I think at first it was meant to be really a board secretary,
Yeah,
someone who just organized the meeting, took minutes, organized the logistics around the meetings, and did a lot of sort of the corporate procedures and for the organization, such as the corporate filings and compliance, and looked after the building of the annual report and proxy circular, and AGM processes. So a lot of it was kind of very sort of corporate procedures, administrative focused. And after the TSX report in 1994, requirements around committees, definitely new regulatory implications in terms of disclosure, in terms of compliance, and that meant that everything changed essentially. And so the role of the corporate secretary over the last 20 years has become way more strategic. It has, it's no longer just someone kind of coming up from the administrative or other fields. A lot of them have legal backgrounds. A lot of them have a law degree. Some of them are chief governance officers. They're C-suite executives. They have a seat at the table. They are they really are the governance conscience of the organization, but they play also a really interesting role, which really also has evolved from what they used to do, which is they play a very key role in between the board and management. So it's kind of that
right.
space in between the board and management. Not many people live in that space, other than maybe the CEO. And so it's really their kind of traffic controller as well, managing the information going into the board, managing the information going out from the board, and, the sound bites that come back to the board based on the information that's been, created, the minutes, the conversations, and everything else. And beyond that, with everything that's happening and all of the changes over the years with, diversity and inclusion, climate change, ESG, reconciliation issues. But beyond that, there just have been so many things that governance professionals have had to be educated in. that would never have been something that, was necessary in the past, so that they could be proactive in bringing things to their board, making sure things were on the agenda that needed to be discussed. So their role also, I mean, essentially looking at the regulatory environment, first of all, to see if anything else is coming down the pipe that is going to change their work processes, that is going to change the way their organizations and their boards have to oversee certain concepts and issues, and the way that they have to then disclose on these issues, and the vehicles that they're going to have to use to be able to disclose on these issues. So they may have expertise within the organization or outside of the organization to come in and help the board sort of wrap their heads around these things, but they kind of have to almost be at the forefront of that, so that they can manage and be the go-between, essentially, between the information that the board will need and what will need to be provided to the rest of the organization and outside stakeholders.
And Lynn, I mean, that's extremely interesting, and that evolution is many people have witnessed it sort of in a variety of contexts, within, sort of from outside as well. And I've had that exposure. We work a lot with corporate secretaries, as you can imagine, so that evolution becomes more and more apparent in time. And you do a lot of events around this, a lot of opportunities for networking and for corporate secretaries and other governance professionals to interact with one another, including a conference that is coming up in Whistler at the end of the month. Tell us a bit more about sort of some of the events that you do and some of the scope around them, and how people can get involved and who should get involved.
Well, number one, I mean, so we changed the name back in 2016 to Governance Professionals because we saw that it wasn't just corporate secretaries and not just from issuer companies that were interested in coming to our events and coming to our into our membership. It was anyone that was really interested in governance, and governance, as I mentioned, had evolved to a much broader and more complex world. So it wasn't just the corporate secretary that was interested in governance. It's the chief legal, chief compliance, chief risk officer. It's the board members. It's the finance, and it's the CEO. So we felt that our definitely where our space is, our lane is the management side of governance, right? There are organizations, obviously, that provide a lot of education, information, resources, etc., specifically to board members. But we feel very strongly that what we're trying to provide to our membership and to our community is the bottom up approach to governance, as opposed to the top down, which is sort of the oversight. Our focus is really the processes, the structures, the frameworks, how to put governance into practice, and all of the pieces that go with it. So part of what we offer is obviously our annual conference, which is coming up in Whistler, and we typically kind of move it east to west. So we were in PEI last year, we're in Whistler this year, and it's going to be a great event because it's our 30th anniversary, if you can believe it, this year. So we're going to be celebrating that at the conference. And the conference is unique in terms of what we do because it's the one and only event that offers essentially a complete digest of different governance issues at a high level we have about 25 or so sessions and about 60 some speakers coming to this event. So it's the beauty of it is that we're bringing the experts, we're bringing it's not just a faculty, it's really about bringing in even the practitioners, the governance professionals themselves, what they're doing in their organizations, and addressing all of the top of mind issues. And so that's the conference. It's 2 days. And what it also does, which we don't have the opportunity to do very much anymore since the pandemic, is it brings people together. Governance professionals tend to be a little bit kind of remote in their, they don't move around a lot. They don't travel around a lot. Not many do because, their job is, to be within the organization and their board processes and so on. So this is their opportunity to come out, to talk to each other, to have fun too. We always make the conference a lot of fun. And so it's a great event, and we get about 300 people. We used to get more before the pandemic, but it's been a bit of a challenge getting people back in person because of travel budgets. So what we are doing now for the last, well, since we've gotten back in person, is we're doing a hybrid format, so people can come and attend in person and or attend virtually live, and they'll have access to all of the sessions. And then anyone who attends the conference, whether live or in person, online or in person, will get the full recording at the end. So you get to see all the sessions. So that's a really unique event. And I also mentioned, because we're so unique in what we do, we're addressing governance, but we're really addressing it from the practical standpoint. And so we have created a designation and a certification program. It was launched in 2017, and it's the only one really that focuses on the governance professional, focuses on the processes in terms of supporting the board of directors, supporting the governance concepts and practices in the organization. And it's soup to nuts. We have pretty much, we're addressing everything from all of the topics that are key, top of mind: risk and ESG and EDI and ethics. And, that's sort of the higher level. But then, the start off points: what is governance? What's the role of the board? What's the role of the governance professional? So there's a culmination, and it ends up with the designation GPC.D. So it is something we encourage anyone who's actually in the role or peripheral to the role of governance professional to go through, because it just gives them all the tools that they need to be able to basically come back to their organizations and implement it. And in governance, typically, unless you're a very large bank or some of the larger issuers, you don't typically have more than one person in the role. And so you're kind of operating in a bit of a silo. And so everything that we offer is to essentially give that support to the governance professional that they need to be able to do their job, but also benchmark their practices and understand what the latest and best approaches are to governance.
And Lynn, now I'll ask you sort of from an advice perspective. So, to your point, governance professionals is much broader. The corporate secretaries could be chief legal officer, could be management team members, and depending on the size of the organization, you could have sort of even the CFO, CEO, etc. So, as you've seen this evolve, and we spoke a little bit about that, sort of general strategic direction would you give to any governance professional in terms of making sure they do good work? How should they approach their work? Sort of what should be their Northern Star, so to speak, that gives them sort of that sense of like, okay, these are the general principles I should always be following?
Well, because they do operate in such sometimes isolated worlds and have very unique deliverables for their organizations, what they do have is they have very important stakeholders: the board members, the chair of the board, the CEO, the different committees, the different committee members. The most important thing really is to foster those relationships and foster the trust, because it is a position, again, that you are privy to the very confidential conversations of the boards, of the committees, and of the overall operation of the organization. So to be in that role, you have to have such a sense of integrity and professionalism. So that would be one thing in terms of personal development that I would always encourage governance professionals to really look at: the nature of the relationships that they have, and if there are relationships that they feel are not transparent enough, that they make an effort to get to know these stakeholders within their organizations, within their boards, and outside as well, where they do have to often interact with either shareholders or regulators, clients, members, communities, and other outside stakeholders too, and as well the management team, because oftentimes they'll be the ones going to the management team, asking them for information that they can bring back to the board. So it's really up to them to kind of sort of make sure that that is understood, and it's the board wants a very specific type of soundbite. So really working with the governance within the governance structure, but with the executive team to get those sound bites and to get them in the format that the board really needs them, and to really put the information together the board really requires. Other than that, I mean, it's education. It's constantly being on top of what are the latest issues, understanding their organizations, because they're going to want to be, if they're not already, the key advisor to the chair of the board when it comes time to putting the agenda together, putting the materials together, putting all of the pieces together, and not just the basic operational elements, but some of the strategic elements that the board should be looking at. So acquire relevant education, acquire certifications that will also raise the awareness of those that you are working with, that you actually are designated to work in this field, that you have, a governance education. Look at degrees as well. I mean, if you don't already have a legal or business administration, finance, or any of those, maybe consider obtaining these certifications that can enhance your credentials and your credibility within your organization. And network. I mean, network with your peers as much as you can. So, because you don't have the opportunity necessarily in your own organization to be able to exchange notes. So you may want to go to like-minded organizations, and GPC facilitates a lot of that through our forums and our courses and everything else, our conference and other things that we offer. So really, it's talking and networking with like-minded individuals, and then familiarize yourself with evolving practices and governance and frameworks and standards and regulations and best practices, and be aware of what's coming down the pipe, so that you can be the person that is trusted to bring the information back to your organization. Because let's face it, your executives are busy. They have their own deliverables. Your board is there in and out of the organization. So to have that constant, as I said earlier, like, you're essentially the conscience, the governance conscience for the organization. So it's really about managing those relationships, staying informed, networking, having a personal, really strong ethical foundation for yourself, having the confidence to also speak up in meetings, and um, be part of the conversation if it's required, and just constantly be learning, you know?
That's an extremely important point. And
Yeah.
Lynn, the other thing that the networking piece, I think, really resonates. I've seen that a lot with corporate secretaries and governance professionals, generally speaking. It's lonely at the top. Often at their own organization, they only have sort of very few people they could talk about these items with, depending on the size of the organization. So
Mhm.
that networking piece with other peers, and perhaps even seeking mentorship, is
Yeah.
just so critical, I find.
Yeah.
Uh, any of these positions where you're sort of at the senior level in the organization, they don't provide you with too many opportunities internally to seek that guidance.
Yeah. Yeah. Seek that community, seek that family, seek the information, seek the resources. And, I mean, GPC is not the be all and end all. Of course, we want people to come to us and consider us to be a primary resource. But obviously, there are secondary and tertiary education institutions that provide amazing degrees and courses. There are legal, law firms that offer a lot of um, very topical and front of mind issues in terms of events. So, and that's also another way to get together and network, is to go to these types of events on a regular basis when you can. Obviously, make the time for it.
And Lynn, obviously, this work is very engaging, but also takes a lot of time. What does Lynn do for fun? What are
Oh,
your what does that side of Lynn look like?
hmm. Well, spending time with my twin daughters, who are now 24, and I don't really have that much of an opportunity to do that anymore. But when I do see them, it's always enjoyable. I enjoy also. I have a really cute dog, and spending time with my puppy, my partner, my friends. I like to play tennis. I like to work out. Sometimes play golf. I love to travel. My partner and I love to travel, so we do that as much as possible. Just came back from 2 weeks in Europe and in France, which was lovely. Let me think. I mean, of course, relaxing with a good book once in a while and just chilling. It's also not overrated.
No, and it shouldn't be because, again, this type of work, while intellectually stimulating, it can also be draining at times. And some of that recharge time is important, which is why I asked, because I think it would resonate with a lot of the audience because I mean, just the sheer amount of volume of emails and communications, etc., that you deal with. And sometimes you're like, look, you need a
Yeah.
break in order to think appropriately and to think strategically around these items.
I do believe, and I really more so than ever now, in a really good life work balance. It's so important to get your sleep, to get your nutrition, to have your social interactions, to have your family interactions, to have your time, to have your alone time, to also have all your fitness time and everything else. You have to fit that in, because otherwise I don't think that you can be as effective, as energetic, and that you don't have as much to offer essentially. And also, you have to provide that for your team as well. You have to sort of encourage and hopefully inspire your team to work hard and to be part of that. But I also emphasize to them that their lives, their families, are equally, if not more important, obviously, and that they need to make that time. And I think that's really important, because we are a little bit of a family, and so we kind of support each other through things. So we're very small. I mean, GBC has a total of 8 employees that support it. So you would think it was it was bigger, because I mean we do quite a bit. We really do. Everybody needs that kind of sort of balance.
Well, and Lynn, I have a question for you now around, and we chat a little bit about this, for especially for women in governance. We've definitely seen more and more women get involved, but there have certainly been challenges along the way. What would be one sort of major challenge in your career that you encountered, and how did you overcome it? And I ask that in the context that you have governance professionals that have to sort of encounter certain items along the way. And this may or may not apply depending on sort of the types of challenges you encountered, but I thought it's worth sharing a learning from you.
I think the biggest thing for me, I'm not a governance professional. That's not my
Right.
job. So I am a I am a businesswoman, I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm also a journalist, I'm an event manager, I'm a and all of these things, it's maybe at the very beginning there was a little bit of an imposter syndrome about, okay, well, I'm not a governance professional, but that's not necessarily what is required. My ability to learn the concepts, to learn to understand the trends, to understand the people that we're serving with the association, that's what's important. And being able to not only understand it, but to impart it and to provide them with information that they don't have. So, in other words, putting those events together, putting all of the programming that we have to offer, creating those membership resources, all of these things do require for me to have a very, very thorough understanding of governance without myself ever have been a corporate secretary. But, managing an association, management, any kind of a business, whether it's a not-for-profit or anything else, it does require different kinds of skills. And I think that I finally kind of sort of came into that sort of, understanding that what I've been doing pretty much all of my career is exactly that. If it's not writing a paper or putting on an event or, putting resources together that address a need for information. And then I finally realized that's what I'm good at. I'm good at understanding the information and then transferring it, bringing in the expertise, bringing in the folks that need to understand it. And so it just, for me at the very beginning was okay. But really what the organization needs is that, plus also the ability to be a good manager, to be a good business person, to understand the trends, to understand the risks, to understand how to take risks and perhaps sometimes not to take some risks. So those are all things that balance out, and that I think have made me successful over the last 22 years in this business.
And Lynn, I think that's extremely important because if you think about it, that learning curve that you went through in order to be able to sort of manage this business effectively is not different than how a lawyer that is now a corporate secretary has to kind of go through a learning curve. They may have had some of this training throughout their education, but a
Hmm.
lot of it is a relatively new skill set. And they similarly have to approach it with that mentality, with a little bit of that initial imposter syndrome, like, oh, do I know enough, etc. But
Right.
you, with the right effort and the right mentorship around you, then you can figure it out. And obviously, people do all the time.
Yeah. No, and I think, and you bring up a really good example. A lot of people go through law school, they go into organizations, and all of a sudden they're faced with all of these governance processes that they've never learned about really in law school because it's not taught.
Exactly.
So they have to start from scratch when it comes to working within a governance office in an organization. So those are definitely things that, you don't have to be a corporate secretary. You can be an outside counsel. You could be, it could be any role that's tangentially, related to the governance office that will give you the opportunity to move ahead in that particular sphere. But being open to learning more, not coming in and saying, okay, well, I got my law degree, so I can. This is
I know
easy.
everything.
Uh, I know everything, but it's understanding the sort of the subtleties of that particular role that is very different.
No, it makes a lot of sense, Lynn, and that's why I thought it resonated, and I think it will resonate with some of the audience. So, Lynn, we're moving to part of our podcast that we call the rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So, for this piece, it's so now we're beyond. So it's more about personal, more fun, and it's the first word that comes to mind as we go through it.
Okay.
So, what is your favorite word or phrase?
Well, that's easy. Be careful what you wish for. In fact, on my Instagram, you have to have a quote or phrase. And mine is from Maya Angelou, and she says, ask for what you want and be prepared to get it.
I love it. Very, 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 very fun and interesting at the same time.
Hmm.
And now, what word or phrase do you hate?
I mean, any really obscene, you know, words and phrases. I can't really pin one down right now, but
All good.
yeah.
Now, if there is a word or that you have a hard time pronouncing, if any.
Many. I mean, as a native French speaker, I will sometimes mispronounce or put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. But for the most part, I adapt. That was one of my growing up when I did, when I was in New York speaking predominantly French, but then learning English. I was very self conscious about having an accent. For some reason, I didn't want to have an accent. So I would practice elocution, I would practice my pronunciation in the mirror, and just so that I didn't sound different. So, but the odd word will escape, and somebody will look at me and go, oh, well, that was different.
Well, and this is related and even more important in your case because you are multilingual. What is your favorite word or phrase in another language?
Ah, ce n'est pas la mer à boire, which means, this one. It's not the sea to drink translated literally. It's not a big deal.
And a very, very important one as we go through life.
Yeah,
It's who was it, Oscar Wilde or Mark Twain that said, "Don't take life too seriously; you never get out of it alive." So
yeah,
similarly,
yeah. Just one step at a time.
how many languages do you speak?
3. I speak Spanish as
And
well.
and I was going to say, I know we've used all three together, and but for the purpose of the audience, I wanted to ask. And then, what's one word to describe yourself by?
Oh, determined.
I would agree. I would agree.
Or stubborn, actually, interchangeably, determined and stubborn at the same time.
Well, and determination takes some stubbornness, so I think they are well they're cousins at
Yeah.
the minimum. Well, Lynn, I appreciate the time today. It's been excellent in to have you on the show, and I think it's been a very fun podcast. A lot of it'll resonate with a lot of our audience, and certainly with many of your members as well within Governance Professionals of Canada. And I look forward to seeing you at the conference at the end of the month.
Likewise, definitely. And thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you always, Gary. It's a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation to do this. And I look forward to seeing you very soon and doing some more with Alexa. Definitely.
Thank you again.